Gosh, I can hardly believe it's a year since we were last here, so it's very exciting to come to this lovely place. And I was actually speaking to David earlier in the week, and I said we're so lucky that we're holding this session here in Pearl Beach, which is amazingly beautiful, pristine. It has the most wonderful flora and fauna, so we're very blessed to have this wonderful jewel in the crown on the Central Coast, plus of course your beautiful Arboretum, which you share with us all, which is great. But I know many of you who have fought long and hard to keep this place as it is, and it has been a battle sometimes. And David, you've had many, many battles with people wanting to chop down trees and do things. But first I'd like to tell you a little bit about David before we get cracking. So Professor David Lindenmayer is a world-leading expert in forest ecology and resource management, conservation, science and biodiversity conservation. He currently runs 5 large-scale long-term research programs in southeastern Australia, primarily associated with developing ways to conserve biodiversity in farmland, wood production forests, plantations and reserves. He has maintained some of the largest long-term research programs in Australia, with some exceeding 42 years in duration. Professor Lindenmayer has published more than 1,400 scientific works, including 943 peer-reviewed papers, I don't know how you ever sleep, in international scientific journals. He has published 49 books, including many award-winning textbooks and other seminal works. Furthermore, David is among the world's most productive and highly cited scientists, particularly in forest ecology and conservation, and we are very lucky to have you here today. Thank you and welcome, David. Can you hear? No?
No, doesn't work.
Oh, you want to take mine? I've got a really loud one.
Sorry about that.
Peter Piper picked a peck.
Really smart with trees, but really crap at technology.
That's right.
Hello, David.
Thanks for the compliment.
David, welcome. And I think the
Thank
first thing we need to know is, why did you write this extraordinary book?
The reason I wrote that book was that when the Albanese government was first elected, I started getting endless numbers of phone calls from, for example, teals, quite a number of teals, but also people like David Littleproud, David Pocock, many others, asking me questions about forests and the forest industry and fires and biodiversity. And after about the 10th or 12th discussion on this, often going for longer than an hour, I thought, I actually need to sit down and write out the book about all the things that I've learned about forests and all the myths and lies that get promulgated, and to push back on that and arm people with the ability to sift out the truth and reality from the myths.
A lot of myths. Don't say anything about me. I'm just going to keep this on. And it's an extraordinary read, and sometimes I must admit I was like so sad and emotional about what is going on in our amazing forests. And but then there's also hope. But we'll talk more about these amazing weird myths a little later on. But David, tell us about yourself. Were you a little boy that loved running through the forest and collecting ants? And so how did you become involved in this amazing world of ecology?
Well, actually, I was ball obsessed when I was a kid. And as a teenager, I sort of kind of kept out of mischief by chasing soccer balls.
Oh, that's not a bad pastime. But
That's right. And it wasn't really until my mid-teens that I didn't know my father very well. He was a very difficult person. But my father had lots of hobbies, and one of them was bird watching. And so I thought, I'll go along and see what's going on with this bird watching gig. And I was just amazed by these people that could hear a bird fart from 400 metres and would know what it was. And
I just got to tell you quickly that we were just at the door there, and David said, "Oh, you've got bats here. There's a little poo on the door," which I thought was hilarious. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So I got interested in my father's friends and the kinds of things that they would be doing And my mother was actually quite extraordinary. My mother had perfect pitch. As a kid, growing up at Mount Morgan, west of Rockhampton, Mount Morgan Mines, she was extraordinary. She started playing the organ on Sundays to make money for the family. My mother was less than 5 foot tall, and she had blocks strapped to her feet and someone helping her play the organ. She went on to the Queensland Conservatorium from Mount Morgan. And so she had perfect pitch, and I gave up playing the piano way too young, but I somehow inherited that pitch.
And you were saying that helps you identify birds and sound within the forest.
So the whole soundscape is really important in being able to decode what you're listening to. So this morning we were listening to birds. There's probably about 25, 30 species. But one of the things that was missing...
So let me just... David's staying here in Pearl Beach, so...
Yeah. But what's missing is the small birds. And the small birds are missing because there are too many noisy miners, and noisy miners are bullies, and they drive away other things. So we're missing the thornbills, we're missing the brown gerygines, a whole series of other things. So our field work, in part, is involved in listening to the soundscape and telling us what species we're hearing, but also just as important as what species we're not hearing, to give us an understanding of how the system is or isn't working, and the response to fire, the response to logging, all those kinds of things. So it's another way of understanding the communication that's going on in the forest. So the noisy miner is part of an axis of evil. And that axis of evil is actually two other bird species that often co-occur with the noisy miner, and that's the grey butcherbird and the pied butcherbird. And so when we study these groups of birds, we can actually do sophisticated co-occurrence analysis that tells us about the signals that are going on between these species. So anyway,
we'll talk a bit more about that. But so you went from football to science?
Football to science. I realised pretty early in life that football was not going to be a good career.
And then you went to university and...
I actually started in marine biology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Were you up at James Cook? Or
I was at James Cook.
Oh, great university.
And I worked as a volunteer and then a technical assistant to an extraordinary scientist called Charlie Verron. Charlie Verron went on to describe most of the coral species across the Great Barrier Reef, redescribed them because often they were wrong. And the interesting thing about Charlie Verron was that he did his undergraduate honours on the Greater Glider.
Oh,
and then
which is one of your passions.
And then he shifted to working on corals, whereas I started working for him on corals and ended up working on greater gliders and forests.
So that was your introduction into the eco world.
That's right.
And so here we are now, and you've written this amazing book. I think one of the things for us to all understand before we go into these kind of myths that we're discussing is the difference between native forest, wet forest, forestry. Can you give us a little idea, briefly, about what we're talking about here?
Yeah, one of the things that's remarkable about this country is that we move across a whole series of types of forest across the landscape. So we have dry rainforest, which is almost a misnomer. Well, these are vine thickets, and then we have tropical rainforests, subtropical rainforests, warm temperate rainforests, cool temperate rainforests, and then we have 820 species of eucalypts, 821 actually, and they form different types of forest when they grow together. And so across this country, according to different soil types, rainfall patterns, other environmental drivers, we get this extraordinary range of types of forest where different species grow together, giving us different invertebrates, different birds, different plants. It adds to the remarkable biodiversity that makes up this country. So we're about 5.7% of the world's landmass, and we have somewhere between 8 to 9% of the world's species.
And so with the work that you're doing, that's mostly targeting wet forests?
Our work in Victoria is tall wet forests.
Tall wet forests, yes.
And that's the mountain ash forests. So these are forests that come in around about 100 metres tall, although there are trees previously recorded at 120 metres tall.
Wow. Can you just give us an idea what that looks like? Like it's compared to a building?
It's about probably twice the height of the Opera House.
Okay.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about them is that the the tallest trees are the giant redwoods, and they get to their top height after about 1,500 years. Mountain ash forest does it all in about 200 years.
Wow.
And then about 250 to 300 years, they're doing what we do, and that gets shorter as we get older. They also get wider as they get older.
Same as we do.
That's right.
So that's where you're working.
That's one of the places. We
Yeah.
also work in coastal forests, for example, at Buderi National Park, south of Sydney. That's not only coastal forest, but coastal woodland, coastal heathland. And then we work inland in the inland woodland country. So that's our wheat sheep belt.
Okay.
And
And so then tell us, with the work you do with forestry, where are they chopping down the trees? Where is the biggest impact of tree felling and deforestation that is really important to us here in Australia?
okay, so before we go too much further, deforestation is the removal of forests.
Yes.
And that's happening at about 550,000 hectares across Australia every year. And so that's, for example, in Queensland, and that's in response to a thing called thickening. So when it rains more in Queensland, vegetation regrows, and so there's a lot of clearing of that regrowth vegetation. In New South Wales, there's a lot of clearing under new vegetation laws, particularly on farmland, but also elsewhere. So that's deforestation when we lose the forest cover. That's different to degradation when, for example, we go into a forest, we cut out the big trees and we degrade the condition of the forest.
Okay.
And we do both in Australia. And deforestation and degradation happens through Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland.
Okay, and with that there's all sorts of impact, and we'll talk about that some more.
Yeah.
So this is a book about myths, and I think for us to understand why you're demything, I think it's important for us to know who are the people in this arena. Who do you work with? Who do you work for? And who don't like you? Who don't want you to be here?
That's right. Well, in answer to your last piece, is not very many people like me, but that's okay. So I work for the Australian National University. Previously, I worked for the Victorian government. I'm an ecologist. I've trained as an ecologist, but my work now bleeds across into social science, into economics, now increasingly around fire science. And my many enemies are people in the forest industry, so the CFMEU particularly doesn't like me. The Australian Forest Products Association definitely doesn't like me. People from the Institute of Foresters loathe me with a passion. So there are those groups, and there are also a very large number of public servants that work in these agencies that are fearful for their jobs. So in the case of Victoria, there were more people managing the forest industry than there were actually in the industry itself at the end. So in Tasmania is a really good example. The latest figures I've seen from Tasmania are about 287 people directly employed in the forest industry in Tasmania. There's probably twice that number of people actually managing that industry.
And we'll talk more about that, because when you think about the number of people working in tourism in Tasmania, then think of that number, 287?
287.
So let's just keep that in
That's
perspective.
Tasmania.
Yeah. And with all these people that don't like you, there have been threats, there have been defamation cases, not just to you but also to your colleagues. So actually we need to talk some more about your colleagues as well. But how does that impact on your work and emotionally as well?
It has several impacts. One is because of my previous sporting background.
You can run very fast.
No, I can't. Remember, I was a goalkeeper, so I can't run. And I certainly wasn't a fighter. Look at my hands; they're smaller than Donald Trump's. So, that's right. So where were we?
About the people that don't like you and being a fast runner.
No, the response in football, my various elite coaches said, David, don't get angry, get even. And so the kinds of threats that come with this make me feel as though I'm on the right track, and that it's important to make a contribution to change things.
Yes.
And so that's a really important driver for me. And that doesn't matter whether I'm in the fire space or in the forestry space or the management space, for example, on farms. There are things that we can do to make the world a better place, and often they're relatively simple changes. For example, and I'll digress very quickly, Australia has 1.765 million farm dams. 97% of them are in poor condition, and when they're in poor condition, they generate enormous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. With simple modifications, we can change that so farm dams become carbon sinks rather than carbon sources. Now, an average farm dam that's in poor condition generates the same emissions as a small car fleet. So we can change around that to give us better quality water, which means livestock do better. We get a biodiversity dividend, and we get a profitability dividend across that sector. Now, the emissions from farm dams in this country is equivalent to the landfill gas sector. There's an outcome that benefits the country, it benefits farmers, it benefits biodiversity. That's where the science takes us to a better place.
Terrific, thank you. I think those things are really important for us to remember, just how this all, one thing affects another, etc. So let's take a look at the myths. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really important. So I just want to go back to you being a thorn in their side, because this is a big issue, because you're talking a truth and they're saying no, so that's your word against their words. But, you know, with that kind of difficulty also is misinformation. And misinformation is one of the most difficult things, because we all watch TV, we listen to radio, and that's a problem too. So we'll talk some more about that later. But let's look at the myths. Okay, so I just picked myths out randomly. Myth number 7 says, retaining a few big trees on log sites will save the animals. And myth number 6, detecting more animals means a species is okay. Tell us about those myths.
Okay, so the first one is, there's this idea around retention forestry where you cut most of the trees in a what's called a logging coop, and you leave a few left over and it'll all be fine. The reality is that almost all animals die on site. And there are some exceptions in some of the birds which move off-site, but they're moving into areas where they're already occupied territories. So they're either going to die when they move, or they're going to displace other birds that are already holding territories. In terms of mammals, they all die in the area where it's been logged. And so it's really important to understand that there is a really potent impact at the level where a forest is logged. But there's another effect that is much harder to see, that you only see when you do long-term work, and that is that when you log a forest, you cut out a patch, and then you move to another one and you cut another patch, and then another one, and then the following year you cut another one and another one across the landscape, and we end up with what's called a cumulative effect. So if you study things repeatedly for long enough, what you actually see is that the more of the landscape that's fragmented into bits, you know, you take a sheet and you cut it up, and then you cut it up into smaller pieces, and then a few bits get blown off the table, and you lose those, and then there's a little breeze and another little set gets lost. So what you're ending up with is a fabric that's cut into smaller and smaller pieces of intact forest.
So those animals can't even the birds go from one to the other, or the gliders can't go, because those coops are all disappearing.
Right. That's right. So the more that the forest is logged, the more the cumulative effect, the more you see that suitable little patches that are left over are actually no longer occupied, because there's too much unsuitable habitat across the landscape.
So what's happening to things like Leadbetter's possum and the gliders? What's happening to those species?
So what we see is that the more that these landscapes are disturbed, the less that the patches that are remaining, the intact patches that aren't logged yet, they decline. And so for animals like greater gliders, which is like a small gliding koala, if you can imagine that animal has declined, where we've studied it in Victoria, 80%. In other places, it's gone locally extinct, and in yet other places it's gone regionally extinct. Now, when I was young,
Can you give us a definition of those extincts?
extinct, that means that they no longer occur in that region
Okay.
at all. So when I was young and I was spotlighting in the early 1980s, the greater glider was the most common species that you would see when you did spotlight surveys. It's now endangered. Okay, so I think it's really important to understand how quickly, so that's 40 years, how quickly some of these things can decline when we have these kinds of disturbances in
Because they live in hollows, is that? And if the tree isn't there, and if they're too young, if the tree is too young, there's no hollow.
That's correct. So one of the extraordinary things about Australia is that we have proportionately the greatest number of species that require hollows of anywhere on the planet. The next nearest place is South Africa. And so that tells us, in an evolutionary context, that really big trees were a fundamentally important part of our landscape, with disproportionate numbers of frogs, reptiles, birds, mammals, and who knows how many millions of insects associated with tree hollows.
Wow. And we see them here, it's wonderful. Okay, so that's myth, Myth number 4. Only small patches of forest are logged each year, so the forest remains intact.
Yeah, so this is the cumulative effect that becomes really important as you add more and more disturbed parts of the landscape to a forest area. And there's another sting in the tail, which we'll come back to in a moment, but it relates to fire and the flammability of a system when it starts to be disturbed.
Okay. Logging is good business, myth number 22.
Gosh.
Well, it is, isn't it? Like, don't we, employ people and make lots of stuff?
So when I was studying forestry in the early 1980s, we were first told that there's no effect of logging because the forest grows back. And so that myth was skewered. And then it was, it makes so much money for the country, we need to keep doing it. And the economics work, including groups like Frontier Economics. Now, Frontier Economics is not a cash for comments consulting company. It's actually a company, if you want the real answer, they give it to you. They don't publicise it. It's not cash for comments. It's that's where it's at. So they've done a number of studies of the economics, including here in New South Wales, and it's a major loss maker. So let me give you some examples. Tasmania, the forest industry has cost that state roughly $1.5 billion. In Victoria, there's been exit packages and transitions, in addition to the losses made, roughly 1.5 to now close to $1.7 billion. New South Wales is about $1 billion. The industry cannot survive without your support, taxpayers' subsidies. So the reality is that you're paying for the privilege of having your forest cut down. Now, why is that? Well, there's several reasons. One is that the native forest logging industry is dominated by wood chips and paper pulp. 90% of everything that comes from native forest goes into those streams. That's high volume, low value. Yep. It costs you more to cut the forest down than you make from royalties and that you make from having to put the forest back up again. The second thing is that as the forest is cut more and more across the landscape, remember we talked about patches here and here, you cut the most productive bits first and you leave the least productive bits for last, but they're often on the steepest slopes in the remotest areas where the roads cost the most to put in.
You've all seen those massive logging trucks that just go thundering through.
And so what happens is that the further you have to cart the logs, the less royalty is paid. It's called the log equalisation program. So what happens if you have to cart logs more than a couple of 100 kilometres, then the contractor doesn't pay you, the taxpayer who owns the forest, a royalty.
God, it's so not really good business.
It's not good business. So
Not
the
good
Tasmanians, if they hadn't forked out $1.5 billion...
Was it guns that they had to do?
There was a gun subsidy, but it still loses roughly $30 to $40 million a year. And there's some very creative accounting that goes into those
Because
losses.
there's 287 people that work in Tasmania compared to how many work in... Yeah.
So if Tasmania hadn't done that, they could actually build themselves a stadium and have money... and have money left over to put teachers into schools, doctors and nurses into hospitals, remembering that Tasmania, I can't believe this in this country, but Tasmania has 50% of its population that can't read and 60% of its population that is only barely numerate. I just think that this is an equity issue as well. When you think about how much is wasted on an industry.
Because they've bought into that myth too that we do
right.
forestry.
And we even hear it just last week. Just last week we hear those kinds of, this is an industry that puts bread on the table for tens of thousands of Australian families every year. Well, hang on a minute. The biggest workforce in Tasmania is roughly 287.
Yeah.
Roughly. Somewhere in southern New South Wales from Sydney to the border, that's at Eden, it's roughly 280 to 300. And the north coast of New South Wales is probably the same. So we're struggling to get to 1,000 workers at this stage.
So we can just get rid of myth number 22.
Yes, we can get rid of that one.
Okay, myth number 11. Forest gardening heals country. What is forest gardening and how is it different to cultural thinning?
Oh, gosh. Okay, so this one really gets me into trouble. So I need to tread very carefully. So
You're amongst friends.
What happened in Victoria when the Victorian government... Victoria is in enormous amounts of debt, just as Tasmania is. There was a recognition from the then Andrews government that this was no longer economically feasible to continue to prop up the industry. So in the last year of its operations, Vic Forests, which is the government, quasi-government organisation, lost $269 million. And that was pretty much standard for its normal losses. So what happened was the Andrews government said, right, end of story, we're no longer going to do native forest logging. And then so what happened was that under the treaty arrangement, the idea was that forests were going to be returned back to health. And the way that they were going to do that was through cultural thinning, taking out lots of trees, and forest gardening. And the strategy for forest gardening and cultural thinning was actually written by an international forestry consulting company. You change the name from logging to forest gardening and cultural thinning. I'm quite serious. It's one of the most cynical things I have ever seen. And so what's happening now is that the senior executives from Vic Forests moved across to the Healthy Forests Foundation, who now take donations from organisations like Pentark, who own the Eden Woodchip Mill and the sawmills on the north coast of New South Wales. And then what happens then is that they're going to provide money to First Nations corporations to help them heal country by logging it. I'm quite serious. That's what's happening. That's what's happening in Victoria. And I think it is one of the most cynical things that I've seen in 40 years of doing this.
Myth 15. We can burn our way out of the wildfire. Now, most of us here all know about hazard reductions. Mm-hmm. And I would think most of us are really pleased that hazard reduction takes place because we feel safer. We think that all that undergrowth is being cleared. What do you say to that, David?
So I'm about to lose any friends I had. So let's go through. The first thing that's important to understand is that when a forest is logged or when a forest is thinned, there's a pulse of regrowth that comes up after that disturbance. And it's got this incredibly sexy term called disturbance-stimulated flammability. You can just say that's going to be an absolute barbecue stopper, that one. But that's actually what happens. The forest it resprouts, or you have germinants that come up after that disturbance process, and there's a pulse of flammability after that. And it varies depending on what kind of system that you're in. But that pulse of flammability can last for between 40 to 70 years after that disturbance. Wow. Okay? And so what we see then is, remember we were talking about patches of forest that were logged across the landscape. That system burns at significantly greater flammability and severity than it would have done if it was intact. So to give you an example from the 2019-2020 fires, logged forests always burnt at higher severity than intact forest, always. That was from Victoria all the way to the border with Queensland. But the effect was so strong that a logged forest burning under moderate fire weather conditions still burnt at higher severity than an intact forest burning under extreme conditions. Disturbance stimulated flammability. So what else leads to this disturbance that adds to flammability? Well, one of them is thinning. We looked at this after the 2009 fires in Victoria, but also after the 2019-20 fires. Is there anything else that disturbs a forest that would produce a pulse of regrowth? Hazard reduction burning. Yeah. So in some systems, we actually see the same pulse. For example, in southwest Western Australia, and also in parts of southeastern Weta.
So with that thinning, that also allows corridors, and corridors where wind can sweep through, and so wind is also a big factor.
That's right.
When
so when
there's a fire.
When you're thinning a forest, you're taking out the understory and lower layers of the forest. So what happens is that more light penetrates from the canopy, above the canopy, to the forest floor. And so the forest floor is hotter and it's windier, and it allows the system to then, a fire system to move more readily across the forest. And then when you have the pulse of regrowth, what happens is that pulse of regrowth in the early stages leads to what's called ladder fuels, which takes the fire from the ground level to the understory to the overstory. So as a forest matures, in most cases it becomes wetter, and the distance between the understory and the overstory becomes greater, and the chance of a ladder fuel spread from the mid-story layer to the canopy is reduced. So when we actually look at this, for example, in Western Australia, and this is work led by one of my colleagues, Phil Zylstra, we actually see as the forest is prescribed burned, for the first 5 years, you get a reduction in the risk of fire. After that 5 years, you get an increase in the risk of fire. So it's short-term gain, but long-term pain.
Wow.
So there is a role for prescribed burning, but it needs to be done very frequently, and it's only effective very close to where houses and people are. So we're not saying get rid of it, we're just saying rethink it.
And how it's done.
And how it's done. So the last thing you need to be doing is burning in the middle of Kosciuszko National Park or the middle of Wollemi Wilderness, because there's nobody living there.
Yeah.
You need to bring the effort close by, and in some cases you need to do strategic slashing rather than repeated prescribed burning, because repeated prescribed burning leads to a lot of smoke. And there are some pretty serious things associated with smoke. PM 2.5, parts, particulate matter, less than 2.5 microns, leads to additional caseloads of problems such as Parkinson's disease and dementia. There's a whole literature on that stuff. So this is where we need to rethink the relationships between fire risks, people's health, and other ways to solve these problems.
Let alone asthma and all the other
Absolutely.
associated things. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry to bring you that news, but
Yes.
that's what the medical science is showing in this space. There are ways of tackling these issues, and that's where the science becomes really important.
Myth number 16. This is a quote,
Right.
and the quote says, "Tall, wet forests were open and park-like at the time of the British invasion." This is a quote from Bill Gamage's book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. Agree or disagree?
I rest Bill's case. The reality is that when you look at a lot of the early explorers' testimonies, you look at early photographs, early paintings, what we see is that tall, wet forests and rainforests, Gondwanic rainforests, were actually dense, wet environments. And when you actually read some of the testimonies, for example, by Strzelecki, Broadrib, a whole range of these folks, you can actually read about how difficult it was to move through these environments. So in more recent times, we've been working with a method called LiDAR, which allows you to look below the canopy of forests. And if you use LiDAR technology in Asia or in South America, underneath the rainforest canopy, you see ancient villages, drainage lines, field boundaries, incredible things. In Australia, we don't see anything. We know that people were in the forest. We know that they were harvesting tree fern pith, sassafras roots, all kinds of things. So what that tells us is that 70,000 years of stewardship has left some of the most intact forests anywhere on the planet. And it's an extraordinary story of stewardship,
Wow,
of what are typically tall but wet and dense forests.
So then that leads on to cultural burning. And it was practiced all over Australia, but different.
So we need to unpack the nuance here.
Yes.
So these tall wet forests, including many of the forests in these areas, were not subject to widespread cultural burning.
Because I think we all think that, you know, our First Nations people just went around and backburnt all the time and grew food. Simply.
That's right. The reality is it's much, much more nuanced than that. So we're talking about 350 First Nations around the country. Men and women burnt country for different reasons. But by and large, the burning was very localised and for very specific purposes. So our First Nations mentors tell us that there was 3 broad types of fire. Actually 4. One was pathway fire. So if you were living in Canberra and you were going to the high country to collect bogong moths, there would be a pathway fire that would be probably 1 or 2 tables width, maybe the width of this stage. And that was deliberate over a very prolonged distance because there are things in the landscape that you don't want to stand on. You need to remember that Australia 250 years ago had enormous numbers of burrowing animals, small mammals, and there were things that liked to eat them. And if you stand on some of those things, it's not very good.
They like to eat you too.
No, they like to, if you're envenomated by some of these snakes,
yes.
That doesn't lead you to a good place. So that's the first thing, pathway burns. The second one was local camp burns, and these were burns that were done very close to where people lived or set up camps, and they were quite constrained. The third type of burns were women's fire, and they were burning small areas of country for tubers and other crops. And there might have been 15 to 20 of those, each of about a hectare, maybe 2 hectares. The same for men's fire. Men's fire was to create green pick. These were smart people. They wanted to bring the animals to them to create green pick over a small area. And so there might have been 10 to 20 of these 1 to 2 hectare burns to create the green pick to then be able to hunt.
So the kangaroos would come closer.
Would come to them. And we actually see that in our research work at Jarvis Bay, at Buddaree National Park, the concentration of macropods and other grazing animals that were hunted when you have small-scale fires. So the process of burning over massive areas is actually not right relative to the ecology, but also relative to the oral history of how fire was used. So Aboriginal people were not farming. They were harvesting resources across the landscape. Aboriginal people did not trade food. They shared food, but they didn't trade food. So the need to burn vast areas of country for farming is actually not correct.
Thank you. Okay, on to something a little bit political. Myth 26. Government regulators will keep the bastards honest. Now, tell us a little bit about Monique Dawson of the Vic Forest CEO, and also Joel Fitzgibbon, who has a major role in Canberra these days.
Right. Okay. So this is a myth that's perpetrated regularly. Is that if we don't log our forests, then we're going to have to log forests in Borneo and elsewhere that have much poorer regulation than us. So let's unpack that briefly. Remember that our native forest logging industry is 90% wood chips and paper pulp. We are not going to be importing huge amounts of rainforest timber to turn into paper and boxed liners and other things. Next time you eat Arnott's assorted biscuits, think about the little liner between the different species of biscuits and then think about the forest where that's come from. Let's park that to one side.
There goes your enjoyment of your biscuit.
That's right. So the reality here is that the industry is structured in a way that 90% of the sawn timber actually comes from plantations. That's floorboards, roof trusses, furniture. Okay, that's crucial. But the other side of the myth goes that our forests are much better regulated than the forests elsewhere. the reality is that there's widespread breaches of logging prescriptions. There's court cases going on in New South Wales regularly now. And some criminal lawyers actually believe that New South Wales Forest Corporation, with the number of prosecutions that it's had in the Land and Environment Court, should be actually considered to be a criminal organisation. Because that legislation was brought in because of bikie laws. And the whole idea was that you weren't supposed to consort with criminal organisations because they were not fit and proper people. Well, New South Wales Forest Corp has actually had more prosecutions than the Bandidos and some of these other groups. I'm quite serious in terms of large old trees logged, areas that are cut down that shouldn't be. And in the case of Victoria, it's exactly the same thing. We were originally working on fire, and one of the people that I work with said, let's do a study on where forests are more likely to burn. And we know that forests on steep slopes are very fire prone. And so we were going to do a statistical analysis of that. And I said to him, well, statistically, we can't put steep slopes and logging in the same statistical relationship because they're very similar, because they don't log on steep slopes. And the person I was working with said, David, you're wrong. You're wrong. I said, no, that's the law. 30 degrees you can't log over. That's the law. And he said, well, there's lots of places that are over 30 degrees that have been logged. And so we did an analysis, and sure enough, 74% of logging coops in the whole of central Victoria were over 30 degrees.
Wow.
And the head of Vic Forests then, who's now the head of the Healthy Forest Foundation, said, oh, you're wrong, that's not true. And we said, no, we're right. And she said, you need to use LiDAR analysis because it's much more accurate. So we thought, okay, well, we'll use LiDAR analysis. And then I had to pay $1,400 under Freedom of Information to get the LiDAR data. And we redid the analysis, prepared it for publication. And it's true. It wasn't nearly as bad as what we thought before. It was worse. Significantly so. And so the reality is, why would you be logging on steep slopes? Because the steeper the slope, the less productive the forest, the more pulpwood for wood chips you get, and the less saw logs. Why would you be doing that? Because it costs you more. And the reality is, there'd been so much forest logged in some of those parts of Victoria, there was nowhere else to go.
Tell us about lobbying in Canberra and the role of the lobbyist.
So the lobbyist in Canberra, I think it's very hard to look at when you go to Parliament House. And Joel Fitzgibbon was one of those for the Australian Forest Products Association, taking on the role of basically perpetuating these myths around the industry that we need to log forests to reduce fire risks. The opposite is the case. We need to log forests because it puts food on the table for tens of thousands of Australian families. We need to log forest. Well, I think the best story of all is, I won't read it, I'll tell you the story. Someone who'd been lobbied by a lobbyist made a public statement saying that we need to log forests because they're growing so fast that they'll just keep growing. And we don't have any animals in Australia that eat eucalypt leaves, and they'll just keep growing and growing and growing, and this is going to get out of hand.
Who was that person,
And
David?
I got a phone call from the ABC, and they said, have you heard this statement from the Forestry and Conservation Minister? And I was quite young at this stage, and I just said, well, and I would have said off the record, but I didn't say that. I said, last time I looked, there were actually animals that eat eucalypt leaves, and the minister might have even heard of them. Things like koalas and greater gliders. And also, trees don't just grow on infinitum. And so the statement was we needed to bring giraffes. We'd have to have giraffes in Australia to eat the leaves. I kid you not. And I said, well, the average giraffe is about 11 to 15 metres tall maximum, so that still leaves about 60 metres below where the canopy was. Anyway, of course, that went into the ABC, and I got called into the minister's office with a please explain. And then I got a lecture about how we needed to privatise forests because that would have been much more efficient. So can anybody guess who that might have been? Wilson Tucky. Iron Bar Tucky.
Iron Bar Tucky. Look, I'm just watching the time here, so we don't have a huge amount of time, but just talking about governments, I think it's important to, what do you think is, how do you think the Albanese government's going with logging? And they're going to change the Act, the EPBC Act. What needs to happen there to change that, because this is all related to climate change, don't forget.
So I think the Albanese government has been quite disappointing. If we were to stop native forest logging, that would be equivalent to roughly 14% of our emissions reduction target. It would also actually free up a lot of money to invest in other things because of the subsidies involved. That's really important. But also, if we were to stop native forest logging, that would actually reduce a lot of the fire risks that we're seeing in lots of our wood production forest. One of the key problems is that who was one of the biggest donors to the ALP? It's the CFMEU. And the F part is part of the CFMEU. Now, the reality here is that if we were to stop native forest logging, we would actually see more investment in the plantation sector. And the New Zealanders did this in 2002. There was a big investment in the plantation sector as an outcome of moving completely out of native forest logging. But there was also an investment in the conservation sector through the Department of Conservation. And of course, if you go to New Zealand now, they have an extraordinary network of incredible walks to do that are supported more extensively as associated with that exit. So there's some actually really good outcomes from this, including the fact that the plantation sector is screaming out for workers. And almost all of the skills that are needed in the plantation sector are held by those people that also have worked in the native forest sector. So essentially, it's almost completely jobs neutral. And it's actually not only greenhouse gas positive, in terms of, significantly negative. Give you an example. In Tasmania, when most of the export woodchip industry was taken out, Tasmania went carbon negative, not carbon neutral, carbon negative. And so there's some really big opportunities here that take us to a different place, that lead us to good outcomes. It doesn't mean that there's no one in the forest. We need people working in forests, just not chopping trees down.
With that too, so this government's not doing as much as it can, but tell us what you think, just to finish up, where we should go, what people can do, how to make a difference, and what does the future look like? All in one, David, thanks.
Can I do a short reading?
Yes, you can do a short reading. Okay, thanks.
This will be a couple of minutes.
Okay, and we've got questions to come, so.
Okay, and this kind of illustrates your point. One of my fondest memories of my late father was going bird watching with him in the 1970s in an area called Mulligan's Flat in the north of Canberra. I was a teenager at the time, more obsessed with football than birds. I was amused by my father and some of his newfound friends who seemed to only have to hear a bird fart from 400 metres to instantly know what it was. Sorry for the repeating the line. But it was a nice way to spend time with my dad, and it eventually fostered a deep interest in ornithology that I maintained more than 45 years later. At Mulligan's Flat, I saw my first brown tree creepers, hooded robins, and many other species. In the late 1970s, my father realised that the woodlands at Mulligan's Flat were special. Mulligan's Flat is the largest remaining patch of yellow box, red box woodland left anywhere in the world. Dad was alarmed that these woodlands, which are these days formally recognised as critically endangered, were slated for clearing to build tens of thousands of new houses. Dad was passionate about Mulligan's Flat, and it was with his colleagues he began advocating for its protection. This seemed like an impossible task to me, especially with so much money tied up in housing developments. Yet my father and many of his friends kept writing letters, doing lots of surveys, recruiting others to get involved, and forever lobbying bureaucrats and politicians. He and his increasing number of friends never gave up. Protecting Mulligan's Flat was just too important. Today, Mulligan's Flat is not only protected as a reserve, but is surrounded by a predator-proof fence to keep out foxes and cats. And there have been highly successful reintroductions of mammals such as the eastern quoll, eastern bettong, and the bush stone curlew. It's a fantastic place to visit. Visitor centre at Mulligan's Flats often teeming with people on weekends and sometimes doubles as a conference centre during the week. There's even nighttime tours to see amazing animals, but the tours are often fully booked. My dad's ashes are scattered at Mulligan's Flat. At the visitor centre is a fire pit with a nearby wooden seat that's got a plaque bearing his name. I've sat on that seat many, many times, looking out over Mulligan's Flat and thinking of my dad. His work and that of so many others shows what a group of passionate, persistent and engaged people can achieve in protecting Australia's environments.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you so much, David. We can take some questions now. Oh, gosh, everyone. Okay. Can we have some... I'll come down. Okay, this lady here.
That was a brilliant talk. I wanted to ask you why in Australia are environmentalists so reluctant to reintroduce animals into areas of, like, corridors and so on. Right here in Pearl Beach, there were koalas before, and I know there's quite a move to try and reintroduce them, but there's been a long, long delay in doing that. And why, I come from South Africa, where there's a lot of reintroduction of species in areas that are being rehabilitated, but in Australia it seems they'd rather kill koalas than move them.
Yeah, it's a good question, and sometimes the reluctance is associated with, for small mammals and medium-sized mammals, is that you have to do something about the introduced predators to start with. And so you have to do something about foxes and cats, and you have to do something about the third axis of evil in that case, and that's rabbits. Because if you knock down foxes, you can often have an increase in cats. If you knock down foxes and cats, you can have an increase in rabbits. So there are those kinds of issues, and often it means that you've got to fence things. In the case of koalas, the koala issue is a little bit more complicated again, because in many cases, for example, on the south coast of New South Wales and increasingly on the north coast, past disturbances, logging and then fire and then further logging, has changed the composition of the forest in ways which means that it's no longer particularly suitable for animals that only eat eucalypt leaves, like greater gliders and koalas. So there's other actions that sometimes need to take place. And without some of the predators, for some animals, you can have very large populations of koalas that can do quite a lot of damage to systems because they're out of whack. So, for example, in the past, there was a lot of hunting of koalas by Aboriginal people, and so their numbers never reached the massive numbers that they probably did immediately after Aboriginal people were taken off the land. So there's some interesting nuance in thinking about how to do things. But there are ways to do the reintroductions with good science behind it, because you don't want to release things which are going to be gobbled up by a fox within a week or a couple of weeks.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Another question?
How many paper mills are left in Australia?
How many paper mills? I'll have to take that as a question on notice. Some of them are now running on plantation feedstock only. For example, the Gilmore Mill, west of Tumut, and the Bayer Mill in Tasmania. So there are not, and the Maryvale Mill in Victoria, one of the largest, is running largely on plantation feedstock and on recycled material. And it's a good question, because in many cases, plantation feedstock is actually preferable. It makes better paper because it's got longer fibres, and you get a better return for pulp per unit weight of timber that's put into the system. And so we can make paper, good paper, from plantation feedstock. One of the things that I haven't mentioned in the fire space, is that in Australia, our plantations are 4 times less likely to burn than our native forests. Why is that important? It's important because over a span of 80 years to grow a crop of native forest saw logs, we can get 9 crops of plantation feedstock. And in an environment where we're getting more and more fire, we're better off to source our timber with greater certainty from plantations where we can grow it faster and have a greater chance of getting a crop off that area than in a native forest.
Thank you.
I will take that as a question on notice. If you come to see me afterwards, I'll give you a card, And then later this week, I'll be able to tell you how many pulp mills there are.
One more question, I think. There we go.
Thank you so much for all the work that you do. You've spoken a lot about state forestry, but there's been a massive increase in approval of forest management plans for private native forestry purposes in New South Wales. What do you see the implications for biodiversity and fire in relation to private native forestry operations?
Yeah, good question. Often private native forestry isn't well regulated. Often private native forests are in areas of high productivity land that have, so the higher the productivity of the land, often the better it is for biodiversity. The animals and plants have found the best places to live 20, 30 million years ago. And so the potential damage from private native forestry that's poorly regulated is massive. And often what happens in these industries is that if you move out of native forests that are state-owned, you see more pressure in the public sector. We see that in Victoria, where the payouts to sawmills to leave the industry have actually been used to buy private land to then increase pressure on private land. So there actually is a need to halt the native forest logging industry altogether across state forests and private native forests. And the reality is that we can afford to pay the transition costs. In Tasmania, if you were to pay each worker $500,000, it's a tiny fraction of what it'll cost to build their stupid stadium. And same in New South Wales. And the taxpayer would be better off, take the payment, leave, move into the plantation sector, and please don't come back, because that does happen. So there are ways to do that. The important part of the transition is you do it quickly and you do it with certainty, because that's the best way for workers to be able to deal with what their future is going to be.
Thank you very much, David. No, that's quite all right. I'm just, we're going to wind up, and I'm sorry for people who did not. I know we could talk forever, really. Maybe we'll have another, we'll invite David back. Book signings outside, thank you very much, in the tent. Please be mindful and remember and applaud that David gives his royalties to his students' studies, is that correct?
My students,
Who supports his students, which I think is an extraordinary, generous thing to do. And so buying a book is also a great thing to do, and he'll be able to sign it for you. Thank you so much, and please thank Professor David Lindenmayer.